May 5, 1945, 0600 hours. A Soviet artillery barrage tears through a German supply column outside Olomouc, Czechoslovakia. Horses scream. Trucks explode into columns of black smoke. A sergeant named Klaus Dieter, 23 years old, a mechanic from Stuttgart, watches his best friend's body disappear into a crater that wasn't there 3 seconds ago. He is not thinking about Hitler. He is not thinking about the Reich. He is thinking about one thing and one thing only: the direction of west. Because west is where the Americans are, and east is where the Russians are coming from. And every soldier in this column, every single man who has spent any time on the Eastern Front, or heard from anyone who knows with an animal certainty that the distance between those two directions is the distance between surviving this war and not surviving it. 350,000 men are about to make the most desperate gamble of the entire Second World War. And the man who will decide whether they live or die is sitting in a forward headquarters in Pilsen, reading a message that no one in the history of the United States Army has ever received before. His name is George S. Patton. And what he is about to do in the next 72 hours will be debated by historians for the next 80 years. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our exciting upcoming videos. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Become part of our comm. To understand what Patton is holding in his hands in that headquarters building in May 1945, you have to understand what the Eastern Front had done to the German military mind. This was not the clean professional war of the West, where armies fought, surrendered, and were processed through established channels, with something resembling order. The Eastern Front was something else entirely. From the moment Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, both sides had understood that the conventions governing warfare in the West did not apply. Soviet commissars were shot on capture by German order. German prisoners froze to death in Siberian camps by the millions. Villages burned. Populations were exterminated, relocated, starved as deliberate military policy. Entire cities were reduced to rubble and then fought over street by street, building by building, floor by floor, in battles that lasted months and consumed human beings like fuel. By the spring of 1945, the Soviet advance from the east had built up a momentum and a violence that was visible from 50 miles away if you knew how to read the sky. The columns of smoke, the constant thunder of artillery that didn't stop day or night. The refugees coming west, tens of thousands of them, civilians and soldiers mixed together, all of them moving with the specific urgency of people who have seen what is behind them and will do anything not to be overtaken by it. German soldiers who had served on the Eastern Front described the Soviet advance in terms that their counterparts in the West found difficult to process. It was not an army moving, one veteran said later. It was a force of nature with weapons. And the German soldier who had spent any time in the East understood in his bones that falling into Soviet hands in May 1945 was not the same proposition as falling into American hands. This was not propaganda, though the Nazi regime had certainly used the fear. It was based on 4 years of specific, documented, witnessed reality. And it was shaping every decision being made in the German command structure in those final days, with a power that overrode rank doctrine and loyalty to everything except survival. Into this situation, on May 4, 1945, stepped a German general named Hermann Böhme. Not a famous name, not a name you find in most histories of the Second World War. A professional soldier, 50 years old, who had spent his career in the Wehrmacht doing what professional soldiers do, executing orders, maintaining discipline, advancing when ordered to advance, holding when ordered to hold. He was not an ideologue in the way that some of his colleagues were. He was a competent, experienced military commander who had arrived after years of war at a moment of absolute clarity. The clarity was this: he was responsible for a substantial portion of the forces remaining under Army Group Center in Czechoslovakia. Those forces, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, were about to be overtaken by the Soviet advance. The Soviet zone of operations, as agreed at Yalta between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, encompassed precisely the territory where his men were standing. The agreement said his men should surrender to the Soviets. The agreements were going to get his men killed, or worse. And Böhme had decided that he was not going to follow the agreements. What he proposed instead was insane by any conventional military or diplomatic standard. He was going to move his entire force, hundreds of thousands of men with their equipment and supply trains and command structure west through Czechoslovakia, toward the American lines, surrendering not to the power that the Yalta agreements designated, but to the Americans. Because the Americans, whatever else they were, had a reputation for processing prisoners, according to the Geneva Convention, and that reputation was the most valuable military asset in Central Europe in the first week of May, 1945. He sent emissaries to the American forward positions. The emissaries carried a proposal that was simultaneously a military surrender and a political bombshell, because what Böhme was asking the Americans to accept was not just prisoners, but a violation of the most significant Allied agreement of the entire war. The emissaries reached Patton's forward headquarters on May 4th. Patton read the proposal. Patton understood immediately what it was and what it wasn't. It was not a simple surrender. It was a request to participate in the systematic diversion of German forces from the Soviet zone of operations to the American zone, in deliberate contravention of agreements signed at the highest levels of Allied leadership. It was a decision that was entirely above Patton's authority to make unilaterally. And it was a decision that had to be made in hours, not days, because the Soviet advance was not waiting for diplomatic deliberation. Patton did what a commander who understood the limits of his authority did. He referred it up. He contacted Bradley. Bradley contacted Eisenhower. At the highest level of Allied command in Europe, the question was debated with the urgency the timetable demanded. Every hour of debate was an hour in which the window between the German lines and the American lines was narrowing. Every hour was thousands of men either crossing to safety or being overtaken. The politics were impossible. The Yalta agreements were not suggestions. They were the foundation of the Allied relationship with the Soviet Union, a relationship that everyone understood was going to define the post-war world in ways that military operations only partially determined. Accepting Böhme's army meant telling Stalin that the agreements his signature was on could be overridden by a field commander's decision in the last days of the war. The implications of that reached far beyond Czechoslovakia in May 1945. The decision that came back from Eisenhower's headquarters was the only decision possible given the constraints, which meant it was a decision that satisfied no one. Patton was authorized to accept the surrender of German forces that presented themselves at the American lines. He was not authorized to actively facilitate their movement or to hold lines open in ways that could be construed as deliberate policy. The distinction was fine enough to be nearly theoretical in practice. But it gave Patton the cover he needed. And Patton, who had not survived 30 years in the American military without understanding how institutional cover worked, used it with the precision of a man who had been waiting his entire career for a moment that required exactly this combination of audacity and restraint. The meeting between Patton and Böhme took place at a forward American headquarters in the first days of May 1945. It was by every account of every officer present unlike anything they had witnessed in the entire war. Böhme arrived representing a force of 350,000 men moving west through Czechoslovakia. He was surrendering an army to avoid surrendering to a different army. He was making a political decision of enormous consequence in the guise of a military transaction. And across the table from him was a man who understood exactly what was happening and had decided in a moment of institutional discipline that was foreign to his nature but apparently available to him when the situation required it to represent his uniform rather than himself. Patton asked Böhme directly how many men he was bringing. Böhme gave the number. Patton looked at the number. Then he told Böhme precisely what was on offer. The men would be processed as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. There were no guarantees beyond that. No promises about post-war treatment. No recruitment into any other service. Böhme's cooperation in an orderly surrender was the only thing Patton could offer. Böhme said he understood. Patton said it was going to have to be enough. And then Patton said something that the officers in that room were still repeating decades later. He said he understood why Böhme had made his choice. He said the fear driving those 350,000 men west was not propaganda. It was based on real events that both men in that room understood without needing to enumerate them. He said the men coming across would be treated correctly, and that he intended to keep that promise because he kept his promises, and because soldiers who had fought a war that was now over deserved the protections they were owed under the law. And then he said that Böhme needed to understand something clearly. The Soviet Union was an ally of the United States. The arrangements between the Allied powers were arrangements Patton operated within, regardless of his personal views. The surrender Böhme was making was to the institution, not to the individual. And the institution had obligations that extended beyond anything Patton personally might think or feel. The officers in that room knew what Patton thought about the Soviet Union. He had not been subtle about it. His personal views on the post-war order, on the nature of what the Red Army represented, on the question of which direction the next war was likely to come from, were known throughout the Third Army and had reached Eisenhower's desk multiple times as a problem requiring management. And here he was in a room with a German general who had brought 350,000 men across, partly because he shared some version of those views, choosing to say none of it. Representing the institution, keeping the conversation where it needed to be. The surrender was processed. The men came across. 350,000 German soldiers moving through the American lines in an operation that looked to the staff officers processing it like nothing so much as a flood. Finding a channel, a massive human movement driven by a force so elemental that it had simply reorganized itself around the nearest available opening. The Soviets protested through diplomatic channels. The protests produced carefully worded responses that satisfied no one and papered over a tension that was going to define the next half-century of European history. But in American prisoner of war facilities in Bavaria on May 8, 1945, when the formal surrender of Germany came through, 350,000 men who had been moving west 4 days earlier were alive. They were going to go home, to whatever Germany was going to become, to whatever lives were possible in the rubble of everything that had happened. That was not nothing. And in his headquarters, when the news of the formal surrender came through, Patton sat quietly for a moment while his staff waited for a statement, a reaction, something proportionate to the scale of what had just ended. What he gave them was a question. He asked what was next. Because the occupation of Germany was beginning and there was work to do, and George Patton had never been comfortable with endings, only with what came after them. In the first days of May 1945, a German general named Hermann Böhme made the most audacious decision of the entire European war. He took 350,000 men and moved them west through Czechoslovakia, surrendering not to the Soviets who were closing from the east, but to Patton's Third Army in deliberate violation of the Yalta agreements. Patton accepted. The men crossed. They were alive on May 8th when Germany formally surrendered. But what the history books pass over quickly is what happened in the 48 hours before that meeting, because before Patton could say yes, he had to fight a battle with no weapons, no tanks, and no room for error. A battle fought entirely in conference rooms and over field telephones against men wearing the same uniform he did. And that battle nearly killed the entire operation before a single German soldier crossed a single line. Here is the number that explains everything. At the moment Böhme's emissaries reached the American forward positions on May 4th, the Soviet spearhead was approximately 60 kilometers east of the German column. Moving at the pace the Red Army was maintaining in those final days, that represented roughly 18 to 20 hours before the window closed permanently. 18 hours to move a decision up through the chain of command of the largest military organization in American history, get a ruling, get it back down, and act on it. 18 hours. And the first man Patton had to convince didn't believe any of it was real. Brigadier General Harold Steele had been processing German surrenders for 3 weeks by May 4th, and he had developed the particular exhaustion of a man who has seen so many extraordinary things that the extraordinary no longer registers as unusual. He was the officer Patton's staff first brought the Böhme communication to, and his reaction, according to the officers present, was immediate and flat. "It's a deception operation," he said. "They're trying to get us to hold our lines open. Move the communication up and let intelligence look at it." He turned back to the map on his table. The conversation, as far as Steele was concerned, was over. Patton's chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, pushed back. He laid the communication on the table next to the map. "Sir, the numbers are real. We have 3 independent confirmations from forward units. This column exists. It is moving, and it will cease to exist as a coherent entity within 24 hours if someone doesn't make a decision." Steele looked at the paper. He looked at Gay. "Even if the column is real," he said, "what you are describing is a violation of agreements signed by the President of the United States. You are asking me to authorize a field commander to unilaterally override Yalta. Do you understand what you are saying to me?" Gay said he understood. He said that the question was not whether the decision was comfortable. The question was whether 350,000 men were going to be alive in 72 hours. Steele said that was a Soviet problem, not an American one, because the Soviet zone was the Soviet zone, and the arrangements governing it were not subject to revision by a forward headquarters in Pilsen. Gay said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "General, I am going to need you to put that position in writing, because when this conversation becomes part of the historical record, I want the record to be accurate about who said what and when." Steele moved the communication up the chain within the hour. The political officer attached to Eisenhower's headquarters, who received the communication 40 minutes later, was a man named Colonel Frederick Morgan, and he was the unexpected ally that nobody in Patton's staff had anticipated. Morgan had been at Yalta. He understood the agreements not as abstractions, but as specific texts with specific language, and the specific language of the Yalta Protocols. He told the officers gathered around him did not prohibit the acceptance of surrenders from German forces that presented themselves at American lines. It prohibited active facilitation. It prohibited holding lines open. It prohibited deliberate policy. But a German army walking across on its own initiative with an American general standing at the line, accepting them according to the Geneva Convention. Morgan read the relevant section 3 times. Then he looked up. "This is defensible," he said. "It is not comfortable. It is not what Stalin intended. But it is defensible under the text." The ruling that came back to Patton was narrow enough to thread a needle. Accept surrenders presented at the line. Do not hold lines open. Do not actively facilitate movement. Do not under any circumstances commit anything to paper that suggests a deliberate policy of diversion. Patton read the ruling. He read it again. Then he told Gay to get Böhme on the line. The conversation between Patton and Böhme before the formal meeting lasted 11 minutes by the account of the signals officer who timed it. Patton told Böhme what was on offer. Geneva Convention protections. Prisoner of war processing. Nothing else. No guarantees. No promises about post-war treatment. Böhme asked one question. He asked whether the men would be separated from their officers during processing. Patton said that standard procedures would apply, which meant yes eventually, but not immediately, and that the processing would be orderly. Böhme was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said that it was enough. That was the entire negotiation. 11 minutes and one question. Because Böhme was not negotiating for favorable terms. He was negotiating for existence. And existence in May 1945 required only one thing: not being on the wrong side of the line when the line moved. The physical movement of 350,000 men through the Czech countryside toward the American positions was an operation of a scale that Patton's logistics staff described afterward as the most complex non-combat movement they had managed in the entire European theater. The column stretched for kilometers. It moved along three primary routes simultaneously, with German military police maintaining order at the front and Soviet artillery audible at the rear. The men were not panicking. Panic was a luxury available to individuals, not to formations of this size. What they were doing was something more mechanical and more desperate. They were moving at the maximum sustainable rate in the one direction that offered a different outcome than the direction they were moving away from. The American forward units watching the column arrive described it in terms that kept appearing across multiple after-action reports. The word that recurred most often was silent. Not because the column made no noise. 350,000 men and their equipment make considerable noise. But because the noise had a specific quality. No voices. No commands shouted. No sounds that weren't functional. Just the sound of movement. The sound of an army that had decided collectively and without discussion that the only thing that mattered was the next kilometer. The first elements reached the American lines on the evening of May 5th. Processing began immediately. The numbers coming through in the first 6 hours exceeded the capacity of the facilities Patton's staff had prepared by a factor of 3. They improvised. They converted Vehicle Park's open fields, a partially destroyed rail yard outside Pilsen, into temporary processing facilities. German officers were separated and moved to dedicated holding areas. Enlisted men were documented, searched, and moved into the rapidly expanding perimeter of the prisoner of war infrastructure that was being built in real time around them. The Soviets knew within hours. Their liaison officer at Allied headquarters filed a formal protest on May 6th. The protest noted with specific reference to the Yalta Protocols that German forces in the Soviet zone of operations were being accepted by American forces in apparent violation of Allied agreements. The response from Eisenhower's headquarters drafted with Morgan's careful attention to the specific language of the protest and the specific language of the protocols acknowledged the concern noted that American forces were operating within the terms of existing agreements and invited further discussion through appropriate diplomatic channels. The Soviets filed a second protest. It received a similar response. The column kept moving. On May 7th, with the formal German surrender 24 hours away, Patton wrote in his diary. He wrote that the operation had produced the largest single prisoner intake of the entire European campaign. He wrote that the men were being processed correctly, and that his staff had performed under extraordinary pressure and with no precedent to guide them at a level that he would not have believed possible 3 weeks earlier. He wrote that the political implications of what had happened were above his level and would remain above his level, and that this was appropriate because political implications at that scale required political authority at that scale, and he had operated within his authority throughout and was prepared to defend every decision he had made. Then he wrote one more sentence. He wrote that he was aware that the Soviet Union had been watching what happened in Czechoslovakia in the first week of May 1945, and that the Soviet Union had drawn conclusions from what it observed, and that those conclusions were going to shape the relationship between the Allied powers in the post-war world in ways that nobody in a forward headquarters in Pilsen was equipped to calculate. He wrote that he hoped the conclusions being drawn were manageable. He wrote that he was not confident they were. He was right to be uncertain. Because 3,000 kilometers to the east in a government building in Moscow, a different set of calculations was being made by men who had watched 350,000 German soldiers walk away from the Soviet advance and into American custody. Those men were drawing conclusions not just about Böhme's decision or Patton's decision, but about the nature of American intentions in the post-war order. About what the Yalta agreements were worth when an American field commander decided with institutional cover, thin enough to see through, that the agreements were less important than the outcome. About what it meant that the Americans had taken 350,000 men that the agreement said belonged to the Soviet zone. They were drawing conclusions that would harden over the next 12 months into positions, and the positions would harden over the next 5 years into a structure. And the structure would define the next 50 years of European history in ways that nobody standing at the American lines outside Pilsen on May 5, 1945, watching the silent column arrive, could have fully understood they were building. The war in Europe was ending. Something else was beginning. And the first stone of that new structure had just been laid in a field outside Pilsen by 350,000 men walking west, and by the American general who decided to let them. By the first week of May 1945, the story of what happened outside Pilsen was no longer a secret. 350,000 German soldiers had walked across the American lines instead of surrendering to the Soviet advance. Patton had accepted them. The Soviets had protested. Eisenhower's headquarters had issued carefully worded responses. And in Moscow, the men who made Soviet foreign policy were no longer debating whether this had happened. They were debating what it meant. And what they concluded it meant was going to shape the next 5 decades of history with a force that no artillery barrage, no armored column, no air campaign in the entire Second World War had matched. This is the part of the story that the history books summarize in 2 sentences, the part that actually mattered. The Soviet military intelligence assessment of the Pilsen operation, portions of which became available to Western researchers decades later, described what happened with a clarity that the diplomatic protests had deliberately avoided. The assessment noted that American forces had accepted the surrender of a German formation numbering between 300,000 and 380,000 men from an area designated by Allied agreement as a Soviet zone of operations. It noted that this had occurred despite Soviet protests filed in advance of the completion of the operation. It noted that the legal justification offered by American headquarters, that German forces had presented themselves voluntarily rather than being actively diverted, was technically defensible under the text of the Yalta Protocols, but operationally indistinguishable from a deliberate policy of diversion. And it concluded with a sentence that Soviet analysts underlined for emphasis. The Americans, the assessment said, had demonstrated a willingness to operate within the technical boundaries of agreements while pursuing outcomes that those agreements were designed to prevent. This capability required a strategic response. The strategic response began within 72 hours of the formal German surrender on May 8. It did not take the form of military action. It took the form of positioning. Soviet forces in eastern Germany and Czechoslovakia began consolidating their occupation of the territories allocated to them under the Yalta agreements with a speed and a thoroughness that Western observers noted was qualitatively different from the pace of consolidation in the weeks before the Pilsen operation. Checkpoints appeared. Movement was restricted. The administrative machinery of Soviet-occupied territory, the structures that would eventually become the governments of the Eastern Bloc, began assembling itself with an urgency that the men building it made no effort to conceal. Marshal Ivan Konev, whose forces had been closing on Böhme's column when it crossed to the American side, wrote in his memoirs that the events of the first week of May 1945 had clarified something that he and his colleagues had understood theoretically, but not yet felt with the specificity that comes from direct experience. He wrote that the Western Allies were not adversaries in the military sense. They were competitors in the political sense. And competition in the political sense required different tools than the ones the Red Army had been building and using for 4 years. It required speed. It required position. It required the occupation of physical space before the competition could occupy it. He wrote that the lesson of Pilsen was not that the Americans had violated the Yalta agreements. The lesson was that the Americans had understood something about the relationship between agreements and facts on the ground that the Soviet side had underestimated. Facts on the ground, Konev wrote, were agreements made permanent. What Konev was describing in the careful language of a Soviet marshal writing for a Soviet audience was the opening mechanism of the Cold War. Not the ideology, not the nuclear weapons, not the Berlin blockade or Korea or the dozens of proxy conflicts that would follow. The opening mechanism, the moment when 2 powers that had fought the same enemy looked at each other across the rubble of that enemy's defeat and understood simultaneously, and without needing to say it directly, that the period of cooperation was over and the period of competition had begun. And that competition was going to be fought over every piece of territory, every population, every resource that the collapsed German Empire had left behind. Patton understood none of this in the sense of having calculated it as a strategic outcome of his decision. He understood all of it in the sense that a man with his particular combination of military instinct and political observation could not have spent 3 weeks processing German surrenders in Czechoslovakia without noticing what the Soviet advance looked like from the western side of the line. He had written about it in his diary. He had expressed his views to his staff with his characteristic absence of caution. He had been told repeatedly and through channels that grew progressively more formal as his expressions grew progressively more direct to stop. He had mostly stopped saying it out loud. He had not stopped thinking it. What he thought, and what the historical record suggests he was correct about, was this. The Soviet Union was not going to interpret the Yalta agreements the way the Americans interpreted them. The Soviets were going to interpret them the way powerful states have always interpreted agreements with other powerful states, which is to say in the manner most favorable to their own interests, applied with as much force as the situation permitted, and abandoned at whatever point the cost of maintaining them exceeded the benefit. This was not a criticism of Soviet policy. It was a description of how states behave. Patton had spent his career studying military history, and military history is largely a record of exactly this dynamic playing out in varying contexts with varying weapons. The men who had crossed at Pilsen were by late May 1945 distributed across a network of American prisoner-of-war facilities stretching from Bavaria to the Rhine. The processing was orderly. The Geneva Convention protections that Patton had promised Böhme were being honored. Men were being fed documented, assigned to facilities appropriate to their rank and status. The operation that Patton's logistics staff had assembled in real time during the crossing was running 6 weeks later with a bureaucratic smoothness that made it difficult to remember how improvised its origins had been. But the men themselves were not thinking about the smoothness of the processing. They were thinking about what came next. Germany had surrendered. The Reich was over. The country they had been fighting for existed now only as a geographic territory divided into occupation zones administered by the powers that had defeated it. The specific zone in which a given German soldier would spend the occupation, the specific power under whose administration he would live during whatever period of reconstruction and accountability followed, was a question that 350,000 men in American facilities were watching with an attention that no briefing officer could have manufactured artificially. It was the attention of men who understood from direct experience that the answer mattered enormously, and that the answer was being decided by people who were not them. Böhme himself was in American custody at a facility outside Munich. He was cooperative with the processing. He answered questions. He provided information about the disposition of forces he had commanded and the decisions he had made in the final weeks. He did not, by any account of the officers who interviewed him, appear to regret the decision to bring his men west. He appeared in the descriptions of multiple American officers who encountered him during the first weeks of his captivity to be a man who had made a calculation and was living with the result of it, which was given the alternatives acceptable. He would eventually face trial for actions during his command in Norway earlier in the war, before Czechoslovakia, before the final days. The trial would consider his conduct in the Norwegian theater, where questions about his administration of occupied territory and his treatment of resistance elements had generated documentation that the processes established to deal with the aftermath of the war were designed to examine. He would be convicted. He would serve his sentence. He would be released. He would die in Germany decades later. Whether what he had done in the first week of May, 1945, the decision to move 350,000 men west rather than leave them to the Soviet advance, entered into the calculations of the men who tried him and sentenced him, is not clearly documented. The processes were designed to look backward at what men had done, not forward at what they had chosen to prevent. That asymmetry, the way that the legal accounting of the war's end was structured to capture certain categories of decision and not others, was something that Patton noted without extensive comment. He wrote in his diary that the tribunals being established were necessary, and that he supported them, and that the men they were designed to bring to account deserved accounting. He also wrote that the tribunals were looking at specific acts in a specific direction, and that the war had produced decisions of a different kind. Decisions that did not fit neatly into the categories the tribunals were built to judge, and that those decisions were going to be part of the record of the war, whether the tribunals addressed them or not. He did not specify which decisions he meant. He did not need to. The diary entry was dated May 29, 1945, 3 weeks after the formal German surrender, 2 weeks after the last of Böhme's men had been processed into American facilities. The context was not obscure. What Patton could not have written, because the information did not exist yet, was the full scope of what the Pilsen operation had contributed to the architecture of the world that was being built in the rubble of the one that had just ended. The Iron Curtain. The phrase Churchill would use in 1946 to describe what had descended across Europe did not descend all at once. It descended incrementally, decision by decision, position by position, as two powers that had cooperated against a common enemy discovered that cooperation was a condition of war and competition was the condition of everything else. The events of the first week of May 1945 in Czechoslovakia were one of the earlier increments of that descent. Not the only one, not the most important one, but one of the ones that demonstrated to both sides simultaneously and without ambiguity what the other side was capable of when the agreements ran into the facts on the ground. And somewhere in a prisoner of war facility in Bavaria, a 23-year-old mechanic from Stuttgart named Klaus Dieter, who had watched his best friend disappear into a crater outside Olomouc on May 5th, and then walked west for 18 hours, with 349,999 other men, was eating American rations and thinking probably about home, about whether Stuttgart still existed, about what kind of life was possible in what was left of Germany, about whether the choice he had made, the instinctive animal westward choice to keep walking, had been the right one. It had been. He was alive to question it. In the spring of 1945, that was the whole answer. That was everything. 4 parts. 4 chapters of a story that began with a Soviet artillery barrage on a supply column outside Olomouc and ended with the opening mechanism of the Cold War. In Part 1, we met the situation 350,000 German soldiers choosing west over east in the final hours of a war that was already decided. In Part 2, we saw the institutional battle that nearly killed the operation before it began, and the narrow ruling that gave Patton just enough cover to act. In Part 3, we watched the consequences ripple outward from Pilsen into Moscow, into the Soviet consolidation of Eastern Europe, into the first deliberate positioning of what would become the Iron Curtain. But there is one question that every account of this story eventually arrives at and rarely answers with the attention it deserves. What happened to the men at the center of it? What did the end of the war do to Patton, to Böhme, to the 350,000 soldiers who crossed to the 23-year-old mechanic from Stuttgart, who had watched his best friend die and then walked west for 18 hours? Because the story of what history does to the people inside it is often the most honest part of the story. And this one has a final chapter that almost nobody knows. George Patton died on December 21, 1945. He was 60 years old. He had survived 30 years of military service, 3 wars wounds, crashes, controversies that would have ended the careers of men with better political instincts and the most sustained period of high-intensity command of any American general in the European theater. He died in a hospital in Heidelberg from injuries sustained in a traffic accident 12 days earlier when a truck collided with his staff car on a road outside Mannheim. The injuries were a fractured neck and spinal cord damage that left him paralyzed from the chest down. He survived the initial impact and the surgery. He did not survive the complications that followed. He died with his wife at his bedside, having spent his final 12 days in the particular condition that was most alien to his nature: immobile, dependent, unable to act on anything. He was buried in Luxembourg at the American Military Cemetery at Ham, among the soldiers of the Third Army he had commanded. He had requested this. He had said that a general belonged with his men. The request was honored. What the 6 months between the German surrender and his death had looked like is a more complicated story than the clean arc of the wartime career suggests. Patton had been relieved of command of the Third Army in October 1945, 10 weeks before his death, following a press conference in which he had made statements about the denazification program in Bavaria that his superiors found politically unacceptable. He had compared the distinction between Nazis and non-Nazis to the distinction between Republicans and Democrats. The comparison was reported widely. Eisenhower relieved him within days. Patton was given command of the 15th Army, a paper organization tasked with writing the official history of the European campaign, which was the military equivalent of being sent to a room with no windows. He accepted the reassignment without public complaint and began working on it with the same systematic attention he had brought to everything else in his career. He died before he finished it. The men who had served closest to him in the final months described someone who was by the standards of Patton's entire adult life at loose ends. The war was over. The thing he had been built for was finished. The occupation of Germany was an administrative enterprise that required patience and political sensitivity, two qualities that were not Patton's natural register. He was a man who had organized his entire identity around the proposition that the purpose of military power was its application, and he was now living in a world where the application had stopped and the management had begun. The traffic accident that killed him happened on a day when he had gone duck hunting, which tells you something about where he was in December 1945. Not commanding armies, hunting ducks in occupied Germany, waiting for something that was not going to come. He had written in his diary in the final weeks of the war that he hoped the decisions being made in the spring of 1945 were the right ones, and that he was not certain they were. The historical record does not allow us to know whether he ever arrived at certainty, but it does allow us to note that the decisions he made in those weeks, the careful institutional discipline of the Böhme meeting, the precise navigation of the narrow authorization Eisenhower had given him, the explicit separation of his personal views from his institutional obligations, represented something that his reputation had not entirely prepared the people around him to expect. He was capable of it. He demonstrated it at the moment it mattered most. And then the moment passed, and the world moved on to problems that required different tools, and he did not live long enough to find his place in the new architecture. Hermann Böhme's trajectory after the war moved through the legal machinery that the Allied powers had constructed to process the German military command. He was tried before a British military tribunal in 1946 for his conduct as military commander of occupied Norway from 1940 to 1945. A period during which his administration had been responsible for the execution of Norwegian civilians and resistance members in numbers that the tribunal documented with precision. He was convicted. He was sentenced to death. The sentence was subsequently commuted to 20 years imprisonment. He was released in 1954. He lived in West Germany until his death in 1960. He was 65 years old. The question that the historical record raises, but does not answer about Böhme, is one of accounting. The tribunal that tried him was designed to examine what he had done, not what he had prevented. What he had done in Norway was documented and prosecutable. What he had done in Czechoslovakia in the first week of May 1945, the decision to move 350,000 men west and surrender them to the Americans rather than leave them to the Soviet advance, did not fit the categories the tribunal was built to weigh. It was not an atrocity. It was not a violation of any law of war. It was a decision that had preserved an enormous number of lives at the cost of violating a diplomatic agreement, which is a different kind of act entirely, and one for which the post-war legal structures had no clear mechanism of either credit or punishment. Whether the judges who considered his case thought about it is not recorded. The verdict addressed what it was designed to address. The rest was silence. The 350,000 men who had crossed at Pilsen were processed through American prisoner of war facilities over the summer and fall of 1945, and released progressively as the occupation authorities determined that individual cases had been resolved. The last of them were released by 1947. They returned to a Germany that was divided, occupied, economically devastated, and in the process of being rebuilt according to the competing visions of the four powers that had defeated it. The Western zones, administered by the Americans, British, and French, were following a reconstruction model that would eventually become the Federal Republic. The Eastern Zone, administered by the Soviets, was following a different model that would become the German Democratic Republic. The line between those two models was in significant part the line that Böhme's column had crossed in May 1945. The mechanic from Stuttgart, Klaus Dieter. If he survived his processing and returned home as the records of the time suggest, most men in his situation eventually did, would have found Stuttgart in the American zone of occupation. He would have found a city that was damaged but intact enough to rebuild. He would have found a life that was possible, however difficult and however shaped by the specific devastation of what Germany had done and what had been done to Germany in response. He would have been, by the time the Federal Republic was established in 1949, a 27-year-old man with a mechanical trade and the specific knowledge that he had made a decision in the spring of 1945 that had put him on the right side of a line that mattered enormously. Whether he knew the full scope of what that decision had meant, whether he understood that the instinctive westward choice he and 349,999 others had made had contributed to the architecture of the world he was now living in, is not something the record tells us. Most of the men who make history do not know they are making it while they are making it. They know only that they are trying to survive it. The Beihuk that the Pilsen operation offers, considered from the distance of 8 decades, is not primarily a lesson about military tactics or diplomatic protocols. Those are the surface. The deeper lesson is about the relationship between individual decisions and historical consequences, and about the particular difficulty of making decisions whose full implications will not be visible for years or decades. Patton made a decision in a forward headquarters in Pilsen with 18 hours of available time and incomplete information about every relevant factor. He made it within the constraints he had been given, using the institutional cover that had been constructed for him, with careful attention to the specific language of the agreements it was navigating around. He made it without being able to calculate the degree to which it would contribute to the hardening of Soviet-American competition into the structure of the Cold War. He made it with the tool that he said in his diary was the only tool available, which was judgment, which he also said was imperfect. He was right about both things. Judgment was the only tool available, and it was imperfect. The decisions made in those final days of the European war were simultaneously right and wrong in ways that did not resolve into a clean verdict. They saved lives. They violated agreements. They contributed to the opening of a competition that would define 50 years of history and consume resources and human energy on a scale that dwarfed even the war that preceded it. They were the best decisions available in the time available with the information available. They were not good enough to prevent what followed. Almost nothing would have been. Here is the detail that most accounts of this story omit, the one that rounds it into something complete. When Patton's diary was processed and archived after his death, the entry for May 7, 1945, the day before the formal German surrender, contained a sentence that his biographers have quoted selectively, but rarely in full context. He wrote that he had spent the day reviewing the processing reports from the facilities handling the men who had come across from Böhme's column. He wrote that the numbers were being managed correctly. He wrote that the Geneva Convention protections were being honored. And then he wrote this. He wrote that he had spoken that morning with a German sergeant who had been among the first elements to cross the line on May 5th. The sergeant was a mechanic. He was from Stuttgart. He was 23 years old. Patton wrote that the sergeant had asked him through an interpreter whether the men were going to be all right. Patton had told him yes. The sergeant had said, "Thank you." Patton wrote that it was the most direct conversation he had in the entire final week of the war, and that he was not sure what to do with the feeling it produced in him, which was not a feeling that his military training had a name for. From a mechanic from Stuttgart, with 18 hours and a choice between East and West, to 350,000 lives on the right side of a line that defined the next half-century. Patton demonstrated in the room with Böhme and in the diary entries that followed that the quality of a decision is measured not by whether it resolves everything cleanly, but by whether it holds when the situation demands more than the rules provide. 350,000 men went home. The Cold War came anyway. Both things were true simultaneously. That is what history looks like from the inside. And that is why this story, which most histories of the Second World War pass over in 2 sentences, deserves every minute you have spent with it. If you know a story like this one, a story that the official record summarizes too quickly, leave it in the comments. There are hundreds of them. We will find the next one.